Hi, this is Peter Teuscher. I'm here with Toby Demker. Thanks for joining us for another podcast where we pick a topic and see where the conversation takes us. We talk about all kinds of personal development, professional development, and organizational change topics, even a little bit of philosophy. So, hope you enjoy today's conversation. And Toby, in keeping with our sort of new segment that we've added the last couple of sessions, any afterthoughts to our last podcast, Power of Thought?
Well, really, just actually, when I think about it, just written nothing in particular, but stuff that has happened has just really strengthened my perception about what we talked about. That it just becomes more and more evident that my actions really follow my thoughts because it's been a lot of things happening, and it all starts with a thought or my mind wanders off somewhere in some direction, and that takes a lot of focus for a while, and then my actions really follow in that direction. And for me, the last few weeks, it's been really positive. It's been busy, a lot of good things, very interesting things has happened, and been able to focus on different things. But it's all in sort of one different things, but in one direction. So really just strengthening what we talked about last time, actually.
Yeah, I think it's
Yeah.
really powerful when you recognize that you can control the direction of your thoughts and make things more positive and control the kind of input and so on. I think for me, yeah, obviously it was a big topic, and I think we may want to do a part two at some point because that is something I can talk about for hours on end. But
Hmm.
I think the one really big one that we didn't get to in the session was the inner narrator. The voice in the head. The you know I think we all are aware of it, but like if we stop and think about it, we're aware. But we we kind of become self-identified with this the voice in our head that yeah gives a commentary on our on life, right, on
Mm.
everything we do. Sometimes it's the inner critic, or sometimes it's just making judgments or whatever, but we seem to always have this narration that's going on, and that's also part of the thinking mind, right? So
Mm.
I think that's something I thought about afterwards, about I'd like to, it's really important to be aware that that narrator that seems to comment on
Mm.
everything that's going, criticize and judge and make comments about everything that's going on. It's
Mm.
it's good to keep that in check, and take a step back from that. So
Yeah.
yeah, that was the thing I was thinking after our session. But
Yeah. I mean, language is a really important part of that. How you, well, just choosing your words and the awareness of what kind of language you use and what kind of narrative you choose or create for yourself. Yeah.
yeah, and I sometimes wish my narrator would sound a little bit more like Morgan Freeman. you know, One of my favorite movies is The Shawshank Redemption, and
Yeah.
he narrates. His voice is in the background there, and
Mm.
yeah, that's a voice I could listen to all day. So
Yeah. It's like it's not like listening to your own voice,
no,
Like I guess most people are like that, but I'm definitely like that. Oh, why do I sound like this?
yeah. So
Mm.
and then that's doubly painful when I just watch parts of our the video versions of these podcasts, and geez, the only thing worse than having to listen to my own voice is to watch myself talk. So anyway, so let's get on to today's topic. It kind of goes on from that inner narrator, and I'd like to talk today about the stories that we tell. And
Mm.
there are so many ways in which this affects individual lives, organizations, and so on. because we tell stories about who we are, our identity. Our identity comes a lot from the stories that we have created about ourselves and about our past and about our whole history. You know, the story. And so much of the way we communicate is in stories. That's very much an evolutionary thing. You know, we evolved to share information through storytelling around campfires, and then I think organizationally, you know, the cultures that develop in our organizations, whether it's business, whether it's extended family or communities, we have certain stories that certain narratives that establish themselves, and they can be long historical narratives, or they can be you know, these things that come up. You know, we're the whole COVID thing. There's all these different narratives and people with different opinions, and then within groups you have these stories that develop, and it's really important to recognize that stories can contain truth. They can also contain mistruth, and so I think to evaluate critically the stories we tell about ourselves, about our organizations, and I think the places we get to in life and the places our organization starts to go culturally is massively affected by the stories that we're telling.
Yeah, I have to admit that the first time I came across, you know, like, why are we talking about storytelling? What's that got to do with anything? You know, like, that's nice. That's something you do when you're a child or something. But I have to admit, so the first time I came across the topic as a part of organizational development or leadership development, I was pretty critical. That was my immediate reaction. But more and more, I now find it also a really interesting and important topic, and that it really goes into a lot of very important parts of it all. And just as you're saying now, like the storytelling within the organization, if you take an example of change, for example, I mean, the tremendous amount of energy that goes into rumors and controlling rumors or managing rumors. I mean, if you create a part of storytelling in your change management initiatives, and especially, I mean, if you talk about viral change, for instance, it has a tremendous impact on organizations, and that's really interesting to see how much fuel it can give to where you want to go if you can influence these stories in a positive way. And of course you can if you give some thought about it. But I guess it starts with the individuals, of course. What are the stories you want to tell? Creating stories. So there's a lot of different areas we can go through from this.
Yeah.
But just saying that my initial reaction to storytelling was like, what is that? But I realized that now that it's actually a very powerful tool to get familiarized with, both for organizations and for individuals. I mean, for myself as well.
Yeah, when you look at the news and politics, they make an effort to drive certain narratives, and you see it in people who try to, you know, create propaganda, right? They create stories, right? And so in the same way that those can be used for political or manipulative reasons, you can also guide the direction of your story, your narrative, in order to have more positive outcomes. And that's on an individual basis or within an organization. And I think when you take control of the narrative, when you take control of the stories that are being told and the way they're being told, you mentioned language, really important. What are the words that are being used? And that really gives, that can create a paradigm shift. I mean, it changes the perspective of things by way of the story that you're telling. I was talking to someone recently. They were talking about the organization they were in felt like a sinking ship. If you're going to tell that story, and if more and more people start to tell that story, imagine the direction that the organization could go, right? And so if you don't course correct some of the stories that are being told, it can really take organizations in a bad place if enough people adopt that story and believe in it. And the same for individuals, right? If you continue to read, so if you have a bad experience, if you have what you perceive as a failure or something, an outcome that you're not happy with, and then you create a story out of that, like I'm not good enough, or that'll never work out for me, or any of these kind of it starts with these thinking processes, and then you create a story around that. I mean, I had a number of years ago, I had a coaching client, and she told me that this always happens to me. This is the way it always works out. And so I said, okay, well let's reflect on that. Let's go back to when's the first time that happened, and when did it happen again? And it turned out it was something that happened to her twice in her life. And all of a sudden it became, this always happens to me. And then that developed into part of the story of her life, right? And so I think this is the thing to recognize. What are the statements that you keep repeating? What story does that tell? And how is that affecting your life? And then from there, how can we change the direction of that narrative, right?
Yeah. And also, what is your connection to the story, right? So how do you emotionally relate to that story? I think that's really interesting too. I mean, in organizations, and in my case, a lot of trainings, there might come up a story, if it's a story that I tell or someone else tell, but there's a real power, especially if it comes from a case that someone has been dealing with, and that case or that example becomes part of the storyline of the training. That's almost always a success, but because it's something that when you talk about that story, everybody can connect to it in one way. Everybody understands what we're talking about. Everybody connects to that case. And especially for that individual, you have a very strong emotional connection to the story. So in workshops and trainings as a facilitator, I think it's a wonderful tool to use to use the stories that come up from the participants. Yeah. And also, one of maybe the oldest tricks in the book, if you want to grab people's attention, let me tell you a story.
Absolutely. Right away, you'll get people's, like 90% of the people's attention at least, right?
Yeah, like people are always really willing to tell a story. Then, of course, pressure is on. You have to tell a story that is in some way interesting, right? But it seems like it's always a really good way to grab people's attention, and people are willing to listen to it. So it's fascinating what energy it creates.
Yeah, and I know from my past experience doing sales training that you can tell a client all the facts that you want and all the statistics, but the way you're going to close a sale is if you can tell a good story about the product that you have or the service you're providing, or anecdotes of other success stories. I think that's the way you convince people, and so if you recognize that mechanism or that way of connecting with others, you know that's a way that you can also change yourself and change your organization by starting to tell a new story, right?
Yeah, sure, and connecting that with. Maybe there's a real power in metaphors, right? In connecting metaphors with stories, or that's also maybe one part of creating the story, to think of it in terms of a metaphor. What does that illustrate? What is the storyline in this metaphor, in this example? And I know that you probably use that a lot in coaching, I would guess, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think in coaching, I think people like to feel like they're not alone, right? And so when you're trying to help someone discover a new path that they can go to create the change that they want to have in their life, you can talk about the success that you've had with other clients. You can talk about personal stories. Like coaching a lot of times is about building rapport first and foremost. If you don't have the trust, it's really difficult to make headway. And so often you do that by telling a story that the other person can relate to, so you build rapport, but also in convincing them that they can do this, right? So you can tell a story of someone else that you've known or yourself where you had a challenge that you overcame, and then it gives them that sense of it is possible, right? Those things that we the stories we tell ourselves that that's not possible for me, or that's generally, how many people can do that? And then if you can provide some stories that make it more real, more possible, that's a very powerful tool. And so I guess one of the people that I definitely wanted to talk about today in our conversation was the late, great Joseph Campbell. He wrote the really groundbreaking book, The Hero with a Thousand Faces. And he was very much about mythology throughout our history of civilization, and he defined this archetype for the story. It's the hero's journey, right? So this departure, so leaving your comfort, so leaving, like the story of the Buddha, right? Having this very protected life, and then leaving it, going through challenge, going through growth, and then returning home, sort of thing. So, I mean, that's a very poor explanation of his hero's journey, but that's a very quick snapshot of it. So there's this full circle that you are in a situation, you separate yourself from it, you go through these challenges, you grow from it, you have these different experiences, and then you kind of have this return home, and you'll see that journey in a lot of the storytelling in movies, at least in the ones that are done well. Even his ideas are even being incorporated into marketing, where there's storytelling rather than just this kind of prompt to buy or to do things. And so but his sort of take on and his looking at the commonality between the stories we've told for centuries, right, or millennia even, the stories that connect us all, right? And I think that's really important for recognizing how much we all have in common and how much we have that is similar, because we all have these types of stories that we tell, and we have this course and this trajectory that they take, and that's what makes them so powerful. And so anybody who's not familiar with Joseph Campbell, highly recommend. He's a prolific writer, but what I really enjoyed was there was a series of interviews that he did, and there was a book and an audio version of it, and it's the hero's journey, and I think that's really powerful, because you hear in his own words sort of how talking about his different life experiences. So I think that's a really good starting point if anyone wants a reference. Joseph Campbell's a great one for the power of story, the power of myth, and because we do have a lot of myths in our culture, in our society, some of them positive, right? I do a lot of work on beliefs, and I used to be full transparency. I used to be somewhat cynical before I kind of got onto my own personal growth journey, and I was very critical and everything about the science and the facts and so on, even though I don't have a science background. But for me, it was I was critical of people with strong religious, spiritual beliefs, and I've done a full 180 on that, because I think there are things that you can't know if they're true or not. So I look at the utility of the belief, right? So maybe it's factually not correct, but we know from the placebo effect that believing in it could help us, as long as it's not detrimental to our, the choices that we're making, or to other people. I think if you look at the utility of a belief, it can be a very profound and strong thing. And I think what anchors our beliefs is these stories, right? Or our beliefs will create these whole narratives that we can follow. And if that's a positive thing, I mean, when you look at, if someone who's very religious and you put them in contrast to someone who's very scientific and is atheist, or I think agnostic is a term that I prefer, but I think if you contrast those two and you go, well, who's living the happier life? Sometimes I was almost jealous of people, friends who, were able to find this real devout faith and just follow it, and it really gave them guidance in their life. And I realized my no belief wasn't really making me all that happy either. So I think it's really so finding the utility in your beliefs, and then creating positive stories out of that is I think is a really helpful exercise. And so you can do that as an individual in your life, and I work with people to build their own positive philosophy for life, right? So creating, and that's a lot about creating a story, creating a narrative around your life. And so I've been working on mine for, the better part of 20 years, like consciously working on, these are the beliefs that I want in my life. And then that way, when I have a difficult choice, I have a crossroads in my life, I can go, well, what does my philosophy tell me is the right way to go? And so I think from that you can create a lot of really positive stories for yourself, and then from there, this is where I think therapy is really helpful, because a lot of our stories come from our past, right? So looking at these things that happened to us, and then so you can tell the story about, well, my father was an alcoholic, or I had all these challenges as a child. I was dyslexic or whatever. You can tell all these stories, but you can then ask yourself, well, how does that benefit me, right? So that may be based in fact. Those things may all have happened, but telling the story of my life as if I've been a victim is not very empowering, right? So
yeah, exactly. Okay, yeah.
Yeah, because you may have been a victim in the past. That's legitimate, but you don't have to continue to live that narrative the rest of your life, right?
Yeah.
It's not empowering.
That's okay. Well, but that is empowering, that you that you can actually sort of sharpen your story, or you can change your story, and you can change
Exactly.
how you view your story. I mean, when you mentioned that about how sort of uncritically view your story, that can be, I mean, it can be very much in your comfort zone or something. But I'm just as I mean, I studied history at university, and I realize now, when we're speaking about this, the extreme importance of um, well, maybe critically evaluating your story and maybe sharpening it, right? That you can change it, you can change your narrative, you can change how you view things. Um, but I mean, for example, we obviously, what we're landing in here is that storytelling is a very sort of it's a very combining, unifying force. We do it a lot in our culture. We create these national myths, as you mentioned,
Yep.
and we create a sense of community around them, which are, it's a great force. I mean, it can be a really powerful force, but it can also be a very dangerous force, right? And
Exactly.
if you're looking at a lot of nationalistic views that are still ongoing in our world, I mean, if we're not able to critically view these stories, we can't really change them, and then they can become very dangerous. So I guess what I'm saying is that it's foremost really important that we do critically view, whose story are we telling? Are we telling you talked about the story of the heroes, or whatever we call it. I mean, do we look at the history of the kings, or do we look at the history of the common people? What are we looking at? What are the stories that we're telling? And what are facts, what are emotions, what are myths, what is it's a very important part of it. But then, looking ahead, how can I sharpen my story? If we're talking about the individual story, what is the story that I need to hear right now? Or what is the story that I need to tell right now? What is important? But it's maybe it's never finished. It can still evolve. It can take different turns, and it can turn bad. It can turn good. But what is your role in it? That I think that's a really, really interesting part. So if I'm in this movie, if I'm in this story, what is the role that I'm going to play? And am I the director or the actor, or what's going on here?
The protagonist. You're always the protagonist, hopefully. I think that's really important, and I'm glad you brought up history, because we often see history as this chronicle of human existence, written in a very objective way, but we all know that history depending on which country you read history books, it'll certainly there'll be some deviation, and certainly there are political factors. There are governments that will interfere with the way history is taught. There's revisionist history, and I think that's a really important one to think about. But I think it's living in Germany, and I think the thing that is great that I've been able to, having grown up in Canada and now living in Germany, I think I'm able to see the contrast even more than someone who grew up in the culture here. And when you think about specifically the history of this country, and obviously it's had its peaks. Every story has its peaks and valleys, right? It's got its challenges, it's got its good times, its celebration, and so on. And so when I first came here, I thought, wow, Germans really have, even when I was traveling before I came here, because I was traveling through Asia for 6 months before I moved over here, and I'd meet other German travelers because Germans get a lot of holidays. And so I would meet these other travelers, and they would be uncomfortable sort of saying that they're German, or they wouldn't be waving a flag or anything like that. And I thought, wow, the Germany's really good. And then I came here and I thought the country's really got a self-esteem problem. And then you contrast that with Americans. They're like flag waving everywhere. Yeah, I'm American, and so on. And both have their good and then they're not so good sides of that. But when you look at specifically this country, and you talk about the power of narrative, obviously, leading up to the Second World War, there was a extremely negative narrative, and it was one that was like anti-Semitism was something that was rampant across Europe, even into North America, but it certainly had its sort of apex here in this country because of the story that was able to be told by the political power. And I think when you look at the narrative that developed about the country, even from World War I onward, it was a very negative one, right? And it changes the way people live and act and so on. But prior to that, the story that was told about this country has been forgotten. It was the country of thinkers and poets. When you think of some of the great philosophers of the 19th century, I mean, Friedrich Nietzsche, Schopenhauer, I mean, there's a long list of great philosophers and thinkers that came, and then Goethe, and people who were, Hermann Hesse, people who were profound thinkers and writers and poetic and so on, and such a rich history of positive culture. And a lot of that is kind of, that was there, but the thing we focus on is the really negative story of the past 100 years, and even that story has been told from a certain lens, especially when it comes to the First World War and sort of the demonization of this country being the source of all the problems, when clearly it was way more complex than that, right? Yeah, for sure. A little different than the Second World War. Obviously, there was that was very a little bit more, a lot more cut and dry, but anyway, so that's just one country in the history. And then you look at when I think back to Canada, we learned in school, the settlers coming over, the British and the French settlers coming to Canada, and all the explorers, and that was a lot that was told. But there wasn't, back when I was going to school, there wasn't a lot told about, the hardships that the native people faced. And now the country has become a lot more aware of that, a lot more empathetic to the kind of struggle that was imposed on the people that were there before the Europeans arrived, and you can there are certain stories that are there in the background in the U.S. as well that only now people are starting to tell about the struggles of slavery, and also the native peoples that were displaced because of European settlers, and then the slaves coming in and so on. So there are a lot of these stories, and I think when you try to cover up these some historical trauma with narratives that are not authentic, then it takes away from the healing that needs to take place in that country, and the same goes for us individually, right? If we try and sugarcoat a story without having to really, explored and looked hard at the what's beneath our story and the trauma and the trauma and the struggle that we've been through, and acknowledge that, then it's hard to heal and move on, right? So I think that's sort of the deeper thing about stories is just, it's not just about telling a better story and then trying to cover it up. That's just like positive thinking. I'm just going to think positive thoughts and then all my problems will go away. And that's more of a sticking your head in the sand, right? So I do want to clarify that about telling stories, where do acknowledge your story. Do acknowledge the pain and the struggle and the hardship, or within an organization, do acknowledge the problems and the issues that need to be addressed. But then don't let that be your main narrative, right? Don't let that be the future narrative. I think is so as we're going through life, we can create new stories, right? And it's not about covering up, it's not about sugarcoating, it's about telling authentic stories. I think those are the powerful ones, the ones we can all relate to.
That's really interesting. I mean, I really acknowledge and agree that there's such. I mean, when we talked about storytelling, we make it sound like it's something really easy, but there's a saying among China travelers and sinologists that when you go to China, if you've been there a week, you can write a book. If you've been there a month, you can write maybe a letter. If you've been there a year, you can write a postcard. So what that means is that when you get more and more into things and you understand the complexity of things, it becomes harder and harder to grasp. And I mean, that's what you mentioned about your history examples as well. So when we're if we look at ourselves, for example, we are very complex creatures, and we live in a system, in a society that is very complex. So how can we find our story when we can't see the woods for the trees, and how can you define what's important, etc. It takes a lot of efforts, and it's not very easy. To tell a story, how do you start? What's the starting point, and how can you move on from there? And if I just continue a little bit on that topic, for me, what I've discovered, I mean, I don't write a lot all the time. A lot of people do journaling and stuff like that. I do that once in a while. I think it's very helpful, I have to say. But for me, writing lyrics, I've discovered that that's a really good way to do it for me. For me, it works very much like, okay, I kind of pick a topic, or I have an idea about something. This is something that I want to talk about. I don't know where I'm going to start, but then finding it's a very good thought process of thinking what's rhyming, what's not rhyming, how can I describe this, what does this illustrate, using adjectives to describe things. For me, that process is very, very slow, but it's very thought-provoking. And when I'm finished with something, I feel like, okay, now at least I understand what this means. I have a story to. If I'm going to share it with someone else, I don't know. But at least for me, it's very beneficial.
That's funny, because I as a teenager, and even into my 20s, I wrote a lot of lyrics as well. I played in a band. I was a drummer, but I wrote a lot of the lyrics. And I think it's very cathartic. I think especially, I found I wrote the most profound things from an emotional experience, right? So I don't know if you feel the same way, but I think
definitely.
Yeah.
And what you said about authenticity there, when you're having, I mean, when you're really feeling something. I mean, I guess if you look at songs, most of the great lyrics, they're about something where you can really feel usually it's the pain.
Heartbreak.
Heartbreaks. But maybe it can be about happy things as well. But if you can connect to that emotion, that's extremely powerful.
Yeah, exactly. And I think the emotional piece is an important one, because if you are telling a story that's a very angry one, then maybe it's time to look at your anger and the source of it, heal from that anger, and then start to tell a new story from there, right? I think that's a really important component. And if you've had your struggles and you've had your sorrow, you can continue to tell a really sad story, or you can tell a story of I've overcome challenges and now I'm, stronger, better than I've ever been. So I think those are, and I know this about myself. And I'm one who really encourages people to let go of their identity as a victim, because it's, when you have the power to, you have the choices that bring you where you got to, right? The area, the place in life where you're not happy or you're struggling, or you've found some kind of issue, and then if you have the power to make the choices to get there, you also have the power to make the choices to get yourself out of it, right? And so I think when you can look at life in those terms, where every day is a chance to make new choices and go a new direction, that's very empowering. So if you can tell a story of yourself being, an empowered individual, that's going to help you get through challenges a lot more than, I was a victim in the past and I continue to live that role, right? And that's not diminishing anybody's challenge or, trauma in the past, because those are all very real. I think they need to be acknowledged. But to retell that story again and again keeps you stuck in the past. And I think that's something that stories can do, right? If we're telling a story that doesn't benefit us, that may be factually true, but doesn't benefit us, then it's time to go, okay, acknowledge that. And then, like the Phoenix from the ashes story, right? To look at, okay, how can I create a rebirth and how can I tell a new story in my life?
Yeah. And also, it's kind of, I'm thinking that it's also kind of a lens to view your situation and view the context and view the world that you're viewing, just by using as many adjectives as you can. This is something that I actually work with my son, which is, he's very young, but how do you tell a describing story? Use as many adjectives as you can. And what comes out, it's when I do this exercise myself, is that when I really have to describe things, I see things, or I have to describe things that I might not have really noticed. It makes me focus on what is around me and that emotional connection. Again, I come back to that a lot, I know. Like, okay, this describing a valley or a mountain, how does it look? What colors is it? What does it look like in different shades of light? And how do I feel about that? That it makes me understand that, it's, first of all, I'm living in a really beautiful world that I'm happy to be in, and I mean, this is just my experience, right? It can be maybe a negative one as well, but it just, for me, it makes me appreciate things in a very different light. So it's also bringing out the positivity in things. I just think that's really helpful.
Yeah, and I think the emotional piece is an important one to keep coming back to, because when you look at the reason that people can relate to your story, right? Because we've all been there. We've all had heartbreak. We've all had struggles. We've all had self-doubt. We've all had things that went wrong in our lives. I'd say the vast majority of us have had things that have gone wrong. And this is where my whole philosophy around everything always works out for me. People will challenge that and go, well, things haven't always worked out for you. Look at this and this. And it's like, yeah, but it's working out for me in the end. So I'm really happy with where I am in life now. And so would I change anything out of my past? Would I change those challenges? I mean, yeah, there's things where I think, with what I know now, I would have made different choices. Okay, but I didn't have the benefit of that knowledge back then. And I think if I changed anything about my life, it would change who I am and where I am in life right now. And I don't know if that's going to be better or worse. And I think I've embraced my journey, right? For good and bad, for all the peaks and valleys, all the mistakes I've made. But in looking back at that story, I've also recognized how far I've come, right? So I'm not saying give up your past stories. I'm talking about creating new stories, creating a new trajectory, because so it's these are the things that people relate to, right? So that's the emotional. You tell a story, it creates an emotion in another person, that creates the connection, right? So that's one thing, but it's also really important to remember that the stories give us a different vantage point of reality, of the ways to look at the world. Like, you can have three eyewitnesses to an event, a crime or a car accident or whatever, and you can get three vastly different
Very different
stories
yeah.
of what happened, right? And so when you recognize that there's more than one way to see the world, there's more than one way to see life, there's more than one way to see yourself, then you can have a paradigm shift. You can try and look at a new perspective. You can listen to other people's stories and go, actually, yeah, I can identify it with that story just as well as I can identify with my own story of struggle and, lack and inability to get the success I want in life. And I think when you can start to tell a new story for yourself, I think it gives you that kind of, well, we talked last time about the power of thought. It's certainly telling the right story will give your thoughts new focus and a new direction to go.
Yeah. Yeah, and to connect it with that, the power of storytelling is really uh, identifying your thoughts. That's at least my process. That, oh, now I realize that this is what I'm actually thinking. I'm writing it down or I'm describing it to myself. For me, it's very much about sense making as well. I mean, I'm one of those people who really like to work with PowerPoints because I reflect a lot, but for me, it makes it very simple. This is the structure of the story I want to tell. These are the important parts. This is the beginning. This is the ending. This is the future. How can we? For me, it's really simple but wonderful way to work, to just simplify things and create that story. Because there's so many thoughts out there, just narrowing it down to this is the story that I want to tell in this context. I know a lot of people don't like PowerPoints, but I really do.
Well, that's because they have bad experiences with PowerPoint because they can be boring, and that's because people use that tool, in my view, the wrong way.
That's another maybe spin-off of this. That how do you present
How do you create good stories?
well, yeah, and with presentation technique, kind of that it has to do with that as well, right?
Yeah.
So when you're doing, what are the stories that you tell when you're doing presentation? How appealing are your presentations? What are the stories that you're committing? How much detail? Well, there's a lot of detail we could go into here. I don't know if that's where we want to go.
Yeah. Well, but I mean, the PowerPoint thing is one from the corporate world to, to even the training and coaching and stuff. Well, I don't use PowerPoint in one-on-one coaching, obviously, but maybe I should. Anyway, but I think that, I'm sure everybody's seen PowerPoint presentations where it's slide after slide of text. Right. And who wants to just sit there and read, right? So I think the great thing about PowerPoint, it's just an aid when you're telling your story, right? So you can put a couple of the bullet points, you can put some visual aids in order to get your point across, and you're just putting the headlines, and then you're telling the rest of the story verbally. I think that is a great way because you can connect with people on so many levels, right? Some people are more visual, some are more auditory. Some are more kinesthetic, and so if your story creates some kind of visceral, some feeling, you can connect with a wide audience. But I think that's just one tool, but it's a good one to think about. We're always telling stories. Even if you're giving a presentation at work with PowerPoint, you're always telling a story. If you're doing a training, you're usually telling a story about a methodology or a way to a story of overcoming problems and challenges, right? That's a lot of what our training is about as well.
Yeah, stories of what could be, stories of what good looks like. I thought about when you talked before, I forgot in what context, but the importance of creating success stories. like for yourself. And oh yeah, it was when you talked about that individual that you were coaching that was kind of focusing on the negative parts. Well, okay, let's create a story. Let's create some stories about your successes. When you been really successful? I mean, in coaching, I know that is a way that we work, but also in organizations, especially when it comes to change. And if you're sort of pursuing change in the organization, well, what's working? What's going well? What are the successes so far? Let's look at that. Let's benchmark that so we can learn from that, etc. So just creating stories about successes also has a very powerful influence on ourselves and on others, right?
Yeah, and I think about when you look at, we touched on history there, and you look at the different cycles and phases that countries go through or cultures go through. I mean, we've seen the rise and fall of many great, well, some empires, but some cultures. Like when you look at South America, the Mayans, the Incas, they have their own story of rise and then demise, the Romans, and then even more recently when you look at I look at a country like the United States where it used to be this country where everybody wanted to go to, the land of unlimited opportunities and so on. And I think there was a very positive narrative, a very positive story, and I think people still try to tell that story, but now when you look at the news and so on, it's very divided. It's very divisive. It's very polarized. Not just in the U.S. I mean, even in Europe, when you look at the politics, we're not going to get into politics, but you do see a lot of polarization. You do see a lot of people telling stories about the other side. I recently did a training on unconscious bias, and the in-group and the out-group, and we tell stories about the out-group. And the reason that so many atrocities happen in different parts of the world, whether it be, in this country or in Yugoslavia or, when you look at atrocities that have happened, it's because we've told stories about the other and we've dehumanized them and we've separated ourselves so much from them that it's possible to do all kinds of inhumane things. And so I think that's where when those kind of stories get out of control and they gain momentum and they overtake a culture or a country or even a community, it can have really, really negative outcomes. And so recognizing that the direction that the cultural stories that you're telling are taking are really, really bad. Especially we talk a lot about diversity and inclusion and equity. All these kind of things are important. But if it's just very superficial, but the stories that are being told within the culture rather than what's in the headlines is very different, then there can be really there are multiple stories that are going on at the same time, and which one is really being lived, right? So this is a big one for organizational culture, right? So you'll have the HR sort of slogans, and then you'll have the stories that people tell at the water cooler, right? And they can be very, very different. What stories
are you listening to?
Yeah, absolutely. And which ones are the more powerful ones that are guiding the those kind of things? And so, people, individuals will tell these stories about themselves, about all their successes, but it's not the story that's going on in their head, right? They're constantly trying to overcome their own sense of unworthiness or trying to prove their own their own value, talent, ability, and so it comes. You'll see it in people who other people will say, oh, they're really arrogant, right? And really that arrogance is just a facade for someone who's insecure in themselves and their inner narrator is telling them a very negative story, but they're trying to outwardly tell this really lavish and overly complimentary story about themselves, and so they may come across as arrogant, but really what's the story that's happening within their own mind is not nearly as great and as positive.
Or vice versa. It could be the other way around as well, right?
Yep.
In certain contexts that you don't you don't want to tell your story, but at home you have a very different story depending on the context, right? Yeah.
Absolutely. I think
Mm.
in at least the way I grew up in Canada, it's good to be humble. You don't want to be you don't want to be a braggart. You don't want to be constantly talking about how great you are. So yeah, you tone it down for any. You're very externally humble, but internally, I feel pretty good about myself.
Yeah.
That can happen as well.
Mm.
So you're right. I mean, there's a different story that we'll tell externally than internally, and I think what I want to shed light on though is that these what is the dominant narrative? What is the thing that's guiding your life and your choices, or
Mm.
within your organization, right? And
Yeah.
and this is the way some of these things creep up on us. So within the things that we're saying, so what's the story behind that? So you can try and have something that sounds like it's got all the right intentions, but underneath all of that, it's you'll hear people that are trying to turn the tables and make someone else wrong and find retribution, and their story that they're audibly telling is one of, oh, we just want to find equality and inclusion, and then really, but what they're trying to do is, well, make someone else wrong and trying to turn the tables. So I mean,
Mm.
that's just one example, but I'm just saying that there are what's the driving narrative that's driving our behaviors and our thoughts and our
Mm.
perspective of the world, right? So not everybody's honest about the story that's in their head.
Yeah, I guess not. No, well, yeah, obviously not. And because there's a lot of stories going on that we also have to identify with in different ways. I mean,
Hmm.
I have my internal story, and there's an official story going on that I have to live with. How do I connect to that, etc. But also for organizations, like how do you listen to the stories within the organization? Are they different from the story that you want to tell? Are they going in different directions? Well, then maybe it's time to try to listen to that in some way, and to create new stories, or at least align the stories, finding the commonalities in the stories, and readjust. Yeah.
Yeah. And when you think about, for example, the news, right? So the news is stories, right? They talk about it in terms of, well, this is a story. And and so you'll find, depending on the news outlet you're listening to or what you're reading, will have vastly different perspectives on or give a vastly different take on it.
Mm.
And so they're telling completely different stories about exactly the same thing. So
Mm.
they're selectively, picking information or facts. And so who's telling the whole truth? Well, they're probably both telling a part of the truth. And so
Mhm.
trying to piece that all together into the story that makes sense, or that gets you closest to what reality is not easy to do, right? And
No.
and
Yeah.
so the same goes for organizations. So if it's so difficult, in a current events kind of a situation, and try and understand what's going on from the different stories, the different versions of a story that you're hearing.
Mm.
Imagine how difficult it is within an organization. And then
Mm.
even with your, systemically speaking, we having all these different parts of us, these different voices in the head, trying, jostling for position. How do you know which story to believe there too, right? Do you believe the inner critic? Do you believe the inner child? Do you believe the sort of rational, no, these are the facts, right? And so you're trying to piece it all together in a story that makes sense for you.
Yeah. Yeah. And for me, I mean, the story that makes sense for you, and the story of where you want to go. I mean, one of the really wonderful things about storytelling, I think, is that you can imagine what is possible, even in very difficult situations. I mean, let's take climate change as an example. You have two very different stories going on. One that the world is going under, and one that there is still hope. Um, Personally, I think we need both stories. I mean, there's an emergency going on that we need to pay attention to, and there are stories being told about that I think are extremely important. But if this is for me personally again, if I would only listen to these stories, I would kind of lose hope. I need to have a story about hope as well. So what can we do? What are the possibilities here? And there are a lot of stories that are really positive. I talked about success stories before, what's been done so far. What are organizations doing? What are the markets doing? What are some really nice initiatives that people are doing stuff? And I think that right now I've been thinking about this a lot lately, but now it's a really strong shift going on that people, now the movement has started, that all all governments, organizations, etc., are really focusing on what can we make possible here. So that storyline has shifted a little bit to where it's, there's this direction that we want to go in. And maybe that's kind of a viral change as well. That it's really taking the spin-off effect, and we know that if we look at viral change, that storytelling is a very important part of
Oh,
it.
big time. Yeah.
How do we, what are the small stories that are being told, and that in terms create this bigger narrative that you've been talking about.
Yeah.
So where are we going right now? Where are the possibilities? And I feel that we're in a really big crisis, and we have probably been for a really long time, but now it seems like the focus has really shifted into, okay, let's do this,
Yeah.
in a different sense.
Yeah, I guess if you listen to Greta Thunberg,
Yeah.
then you're more in the crisis mode. But I think what you raise a really good point, or you point to something that I think is really lost in a lot of the conversations and a lot of the stories we're telling in our current state of affairs, and that is the importance of nuance. So you'll what you just pointed to, while there's these two stories, you're either one or the other, and you, like you say, you need some of both, and there's never just one take on it, right? There's never just one way of seeing it. So to say that you're either this camp or the other camp, it's very black and white. We create these false dichotomies where you either have to believe in this or you have to believe in this, and those are just two stories of many that you could be telling, and we're being forced to go, well, you got to choose between one of these two, when no, there's a middle way, or there's not just a middle way, there's multiple different ways of looking at it, and as we start to lose our sense of nuance in the stories that we're telling, if they, I think you have, when you can tell a more a nuanced story, I think we're really evolving in when it comes to like kids stories. The actually Jonathan Haidt talks about the myth of pure evil, right? And this is a story that we've been telling, that life is the struggle between good and bad. And do you know anyone that's purely good or purely bad? I don't think I've ever met anyone like that. There are people, we don't like certain things about them, but they have their positive attributes. And then there are people who you think very highly of, who also have their faults, right? And so to have this myth that, life is the struggle of good versus evil, I don't think is a beneficial one, but it's a narrative that's been throughout our history. It's one that's easy to resonate with, or it's one that's easy to connect with because it's so familiar to us. But when you start to look at now very nuanced storytelling, people can relate more, because the bad guy in the story, the antagonist, isn't just this. They've got a more complex story, right? It's not just there's a reason they got to where they are, and they their choices stem from trauma or difficulty or challenge, and they've chosen to take a darker path or whatever, and then. You contrast that with the protagonist, or someone who, has become virtuous. They didn't just get there overnight. They probably made some bad decisions as well. And so the stories we tell about people demonizing people, or really propelling people to this kind of holy status. I think those are extremes that are important to avoid in the stories that we tell, right? And as we start to have more nuance, and I think that, you talked about having with your son, and what kind of stories do you tell? I think that there is an evolution of the way we tell stories which is becoming much better, from the primitive hero versus the villain kind of narrative, where having more nuance is really important. So when things are too cut and dry, when things are too black and white in the stories that you're hearing or the stories that you're telling, then they're not authentic. There's something missing there. They can create those black and white stories can create a lot of emotion, and they can get people riled up. But when I look at the news, or there's just, people are so worried about misinformation on the internet, but there's a few things that you can just look at and go, ask yourself, is this nuanced? How is this biased? And reminding yourself that this is just one opinion. Even when you're listening to, the news is so much more about opinions now. You have these people giving their opinions, these experts giving their opinions. But you can have a room full of experts, and they will, they may be some consensus, but there's not one of those people who have exactly the same view on everything. They always have some nuance, some kind of variation of the way they see the truth.
Sure, yeah, and also, I mean, I like that, and the one way to look at the power of listening to new stories or making room for new stories. I mean, just last week, the Nobel Prize for this year was announced for I forgot his name. It was an author that I didn't know about, but the reason, I think one of the reasons they chose him as to get the prize was because he's telling stories about the colonial history that we haven't heard before. He's putting a new lens on these things, and I think he was pretty much unknown to everybody, common people before this. But now he's going to be really famous. His story is going to be told all over the world, and we're going to perhaps look at a lot of these things with new lenses. So creating room for these new stories to listen to. I think it just illustrates a little bit the power of storytelling, that they can be very influential. Not everybody's going to get a Nobel Prize, but it's a good achievement.
Absolutely. And I think maybe one of the last points I want to make is, they recognize the momentum that stories can have. They have a certain trajectory, but they build momentum. And I think when you see a story building momentum that is not beneficial, or then the thing to do, there's a lot of talk about censorship and so on. I think it's important to let people share their point of view and to share their story. And I think the solution for poor stories or poor opinions is not to silence them. It's about more dialogue. Tell your story in a better way, or you in a more convincing way, and then that other story will lose momentum and lose power. And so when we support stories, when we then, like you talked at the beginning, I think, about gossip, and I think those are stories that we tell. And if we tell that story to someone else and they tell it to someone else, that starts to build momentum, right? And so I think it's important to recognize the myths or the negative stories that we give power to, in that we retell them. We continue to retell them. Either everyone we meet, we keep telling the same story, and then as I said last time, our unconscious is always listening to to the things we say. And so either you'll be affecting yourself by continuing to tell that story, or if you're culturally or within an organization, if you propagate that same story, then you'll be contributing to the life of that. In the same way we want to stop the virus. If you can't. It can't replicate if it can't be transmitted. But the same with our stories. Story can be very much like a virus.
Ah, that's a good metaphor.
So
So
yeah, so maybe that's a good place to wrap it up for today.
yeah, I was thinking, could I just ask you
Sure.
one just very quickly, and maybe I'm putting you on the spot here, but I was just thinking, do you have a recommendation for a story that you think is really appealing?
Oh, do I have
I
just
could, because I
one?
just thought about, I just thought about that before, so I could start. If you have one, just go. But when I think about storytelling, have you seen this movie, Big Fish? I think it's called Big Fish.
Yeah. I haven't
Um,
seen it, but I've heard of it. Yes, yes.
yeah, okay. Well, it's actually all about storytelling, and you imagine wonderful small stories weaved into one big story, and it's sort of a battle about imagination, between imagination and what's possible and what's not possible, and in the end it turns out to just have this wonderful story. When I think about storytelling, think a lot about that movie, actually, so that's something that I would recommend. Go and see that movie. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, I mean, there's an endless list. I mean, I mentioned that Morgan Freeman, and because the Shawshank Redemption is probably my
Oh yeah.
all-time favorite movie. But that's for me, that's a story about hope, right? Even though
Hmm.
it's a lot of challenge and violence and so on, but for me a story about hope. But I think in terms of there are lots of short good reads, like Paulo Coelho's The Alchemist is a great one about
Oh, okay.
looking for treasure, looking for that success in life, and it was actually right where it was right under your nose, sort of thing. Or Hermann Hesse. First book that I read of his was Siddhartha, which
Hmm.
is kind of a retelling of the Buddha story. And but there's tons. There's like Ogmandino, who's the greatest salesman in the world, and like there are a lot of these little small books. Actually, one of my favorites, actually, that I back in Canada, an old friend Melissa, she gave me a book called "Who Moved My Cheese."
Oh
And
yeah,
it's
wow.
you know that one, and
Yeah.
so that's all about dealing with change, where they've these two fictitious characters, and they're in a maze, and they've got this pile of cheese, and they don't realize that it's being depleted, and then all of a sudden the cheese is gone, and one guy's going, "Oh, who moved my cheese?"
Mm.
And one of the guys, one of the characters decides to go out in the maze. And the other is, no, I'm going to wait here until the cheese returns, right?
Yeah.
And one of the really powerful messages, because one of them would write these notes to self on the wall going through the maze, and he wrote, what would I do if I wasn't afraid? And I think that's one of the most powerful one-liners that I've ever read,
Hmm.
because in sense making, and trying to figure out the choices we want to make, I think that's a really good one. So
Mm.
yeah, sorry, that's a whole list of them, but there's
That's
just
great. Yeah,
I
no,
have an
that's just what we want to hear. Yeah.
endless list of great little stories
Mm.
that
But
I
right there, you just illustrate the power of it.
yeah.
Like how powerful it can be. You remember what I mean? It's a book about change, right? But just it's illustrated in a nice little story, and you remember that one line like really powerful. That's great. Mhm.
Yeah, it seems like a children's story, but it's actually a very powerful story for adults, right?
Yeah.
This sense of being in our comfort zone, and I'm entitled to this, and then realizing that by trying to be stuck in the present or in the past, then you're never going to be able to move forward. So yeah, no, tons of great stories. So yeah, to anyone listening, if you need any good tips and on a story, and you have an issue, then I've probably got a pretty long list. So just write me. Um, so yeah, so I guess just to sort of summarize the things to be aware of, that the narratives that we tell and that we listen to really have probably the strongest impact on the way we live our lives.
Mm.
And much like our thinking processes, you can start to tell a new story.
Mm.
But it's about telling an authentic story, not sugarcoating the past, dealing with your pain and your trauma, and then telling a new story from there. Because every story has has good and bad, its peaks and valleys. It's got its challenges and overcoming challenges, and that's the hero's journey, right? From Joseph Campbell. It's a departure from where you came from, facing the world, facing new challenges, and coming back stronger for it. So yeah, I think those are the key points that I had for today.
My key points are probably, as I mentioned in the beginning, I was a bit doubtful about the importance of storytelling before I was more aware of it. But now I realize that there's the power of creativity in it, the fun you can have with it, the possibilities for imagination, and also how you can, through storytelling and maybe for me more story writing, the thought process of how you view the world is really, really powerful, and it's a fun little tool to utilize. If it's in change or in presentation or in coaching or in facilitation, that's where I use it. Yeah.
Fantastic. Okay, we'll finish it up there. Thanks everyone for indulging us in our conversation and listening, and hopefully it was inspiring and or thought provoking, and left you with some good information. So if there are any topics you'd like us to cover, Tobi can be reached through his LinkedIn site, Tobias Dempker, and obviously through my website, peterteuscher.com. We'd love to hear your comments and feedback and anything that you want to share with us, criticism or comments or suggestions. So again, thanks for listening. Tobi, thanks for joining me for another great conversation. At least I thought it was great.
Yeah, it was fun.
And we'll talk to you again in another 2 weeks.
We will. Take care.
Have a great one. Bye.